thanks everyone. Thanks for coming this evening. It's a great honour to have Emily Feng here, previously based in Beijing for 8 years.
About 7 years, and then Taiwan for the last two.
Last two. It's really to talk about her book, which has come out, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom. She does in the book refer to, I suppose, the sort of 1950s and the 100 Flowers campaign in 56, 57, when 1956, I suppose, when people were invited a few years after the regime came to power in 1949 to give their thoughts and ideas. I think one of the people that did at the time was Zhu Rongji, actually, who's still alive, who ended up as a premier.
It's amazing that he's still alive. I've had dare I say, an obituary prepared for him for years, but still chugging along.
So, I mean, really, it's a kind of series of quite sort of detailed and personal accounts of life stories of particular people, some of whom who are associated with issues that we would know about, the Xinjiang and the incarceration of so many people there, and some sort of just living their lives and dealing with the pressures of contemporary China. So I suppose my first question really is, why did you write this book? What did you think was the thing that you really felt others weren't saying that you wanted to sort of most kind of contribute?
So I just had a pineapple bun before this, and I'm worried now I have crumbs all over my face. First of all, thank you for spending this evening with me. I know it's beautiful outside, and it's kind of airless and sunless in here, so I appreciate it. But I started thinking about this book, and I write about this in the prologue. I started thinking about this book as a way to maintain a connection, a reporting connection to this country that I'd spent a lot of time in, that I'd grown to really love and invested a lot of time in trying to understand in early 2020. And I was covering the Hong Kong protests at the time and flying back and forth between mainland China and Hong Kong, and kept having a lot of issues at the airport leaving mainland China, and especially coming back into mainland China from Hong Kong. And I could kind of sense even then that the way things were going might mean that I was not long as a resident journalist in China. And so I was trying to think of ways, if I wasn't able to live and report in China, a way to continue having that journalistic connection to the country. So the idea for the book started then. I didn't actually start writing it until the end of 2022. And that was after I had left China thinking I was going on a vacation finally and was never able to return. But, you know, creatively, artistically, the reason why I wanted to write a book was all of the stories that I loved the most, reporting from China, ultimately I realized boiled down to different facets of identity. And that was, I define identity really broadly, but it was everything from different economic and political visions for the country, which has always been in contestation, to, of course, different ethnic groups, languages, cultures, gender identity, and how that all was being affected in the time that I was in China. I had moved to China in July 2015, about, I think, exactly a week after the crackdown on human rights lawyers and constitutional rights lawyers in China. And so I think when I look back at my time in China, it was really a decade, it was really these 7 years of Xi Jinping reasserting his control over China and shrinking domestic space once again for political expression and things like that. So I saw the down cycle. I hope there will be an up cycle, but I wanted a longer format in which to explore that and talk about some of the people who I think left a really, really lasting impression on me.
So you write about identity in the introduction and the importance of identity, and I think you kind of describe well why identity politics in China today is a big thing. The idea of there being the great, sort of resurrection of the Chinese nation. This is China's moment, make China great again. Xi Jinping as the leader of the great sort of Chinese sort of renaissance. You also sort of write about how you and your identity relate to that, and how you then relate to the people you met in China. Where do you think you are in this story? Are you a detached observer, or are you slightly sort of belong to this story but feel very complicated by it? Who did you most feel sympathy for in the stories that you tell in terms of this issue of identity?
That's a great question. When I was first writing this book, I took a classic journalistic angle and I handed in this draft that didn't have any first-person perspective whatsoever, because that's what I'm used to. And my publisher, rightfully so, read the first draft and said, I would really like more of how you feel and what you think about this. And honestly, I mean, that was the right move, because if I were to be honest with myself, the reason why I am so interested in issues of identity and how they play out in China, how they interface with policy and national security and more, hard news issues, is because I was thinking about my own identity. I am an American-born Chinese journalist. My parents emigrated from China when they were 20, and they have maintained both a, I think, very proudly cultural Chinese household. I grew up speaking Mandarin with them, and also fully assimilated to being Americans very early on in their adulthood. And so I was working within that space when I moved to China, just as the first trade war, I mean, speaking of trade wars, what déjà vu, when the first trade war really, really kicked off, and all of a sudden, I think both, if we want to simplify it down to sides, camps, wanted to lay claim to certain narratives, and also journalists who are covering these issues and these narratives in China and in the US. So, I mean, for myself, I think identity is an ongoing evolution, and I sympathize with people, I think, who fall in between the cracks, who don't necessarily define themselves very easily within constrained definitions of this is Chinese, this is not. And I think a lot of the people that I profile consider themselves proudly Chinese, some, not all, but some, most of the people in this book, but they just have very different definitions for how broad, how encompassing that definition of Chinese can be. Who do I sympathize most with in this book? I mean, kind of all of these people in a way. I think that's why I ended up choosing these people. There were many, many more characters in my first draft. In fact, even more in my proposal, and I had to kind of winnow them down because my publisher was like, these are all foreign names. There's too many people. You've really got to simplify. But all the people who I decided to keep in this book, I think have just such a strong spirit of resilience, knowing when to compromise, but not compromising on exactly who they are. So for people who haven't read the book yet, there's everyone from, I begin the book with a woman who starts out as a prosecutor working for a provincial government, enforcing basically the state's diktats and building up what she thinks is a robust rule of law system as China is opening up to the rest of the world and letting foreign investment in. She decides to then become a human rights lawyer about mid-career, crosses the aisle, so to speak. So she sees both sides, and she has a very, very different vision for what China, with a constitution nominally protecting civil rights, what that China should look like. I take readers from kind of the eastern seaboard, where this woman is working, the urban center of mainland China, and then we go out to the borderlands, kind of the historical territories that the Qing Empire conquered. So we go to Inner Mongolia, we go to Xinjiang. And I think that's where the thorniest issues of identity come into play, where really the rubber meets the road and where people have truly suffered because of this narrowing definition of what China and what being Chinese should be. You know, a Chinese identity that is kind of mono-ethnic, Han dominant, Mandarin dominant in terms of language, in terms of gender identity, heterosexual, you know, this whole revival of pro-natalist state policies that's happened in the last couple of years in China, and one that's increasingly nationalistic and concerned with things like border security and data sovereignty and controlling information within its cyberspace. And then the book ends by going to Hong Kong, to Taiwan, and finally with the Chinese diaspora in North America. So it's pretty far-reaching. And what was interesting is when I was reporting these stories, you know, the people who I found really, really interesting and I followed over time, some of them I met in mainland China, and then they resurfaced in Hong Kong, and some people I met originally in Hong Kong, and then they had migrated to Taiwan, and some people I met in Taiwan who didn't stay in the book, but ended up in Canada and North America and Europe. So I think as I was finishing this book, these broader discussions about Chinese culture, about cultural products that are being created in not just the Mandarin language, but other Chinese languages, has really become global. You know, it's not confined within the boundaries of the PRC, or even Taiwan.
I mean, one of my favorites, so I think I would guess that you had a lot of sympathy, but were slightly frustrated by the scooter thief, Zhou Liqi. Because I don't know if you want, maybe for people again who haven't read the book, if you could sort of say a bit about him, because it seems that he stuck by his principles, and when he was originally, you had this sort of scene where, you know, he kind of is quite famous and he just tells people, I don't want to be famous, I don't want to work for anyone, I'm done with it. But then he kind of does become this internet sort of star and to earn money for his family, I think. And it's sort of a really fascinating vignette, really. I mean, yeah, did you feel slightly frustrated towards him towards the end, or did you just think this was a very kind of typical story of the compromises or the complexities that people have to live through in contemporary China?
So a little bit about Zhou Liqi. So I love stories that are kind of quirky or unexpected, and maybe this is not the archetypical character that would bring you into questions of internet censorship and information control and the whole influencer community in China. But I was very much drawn for that unconventional reason to this scooter thief, Zhou Liqi, who goes viral a couple of years ago because he is a migrant worker born in rural Guangxi province to an impoverished family, and decides, he tries to be a construction worker at first. And this was kind of my attempt to talk about rural issues. I mean, one of my big regrets in China is that I didn't have time, especially during COVID, it was so hard to go to the countryside to report on rural issues. But he represents these migrant workers who are trying to make it big in the city and earn a living, and he decides, you know what, this is not for me. The means of production are owned by other people. I could work forever building these buildings for other people, but I would never be able to afford to actually buy one of these apartments myself. Instead, I'm gonna try to earn a living by stealing scooters. And it turns out that he's really, really bad at stealing scooters, and he keeps getting caught. And during one of his arrests, they sent this local television station down to the prison, and they interview him about, why do you keep stealing scooters when you keep getting caught? And he says something to the effect of, you know, I like coming to prison, it's like coming home for me, and I don't ever want to work another day in my life. He goes to prison, he's in there for several years, and while he's in there, cut off from the rest of the world, he doesn't have a smartphone or internet really, this video leaks somehow, and it goes viral. And it has kind of a second revival during the COVID pandemic in China, where when people are feeling very frustrated and feeling like they might work really, really hard but not actually benefit from all the work that they're doing. And he becomes this icon of the lie flat movement. He comes out of prison, and to his utter shock, he is greeted by dozens and dozens of influencer management companies who want to give him tens of thousands of dollars as a signing bonus to become an influencer on TikTok, which I don't think he knew existed when he went into prison. But of course he said, I never want to work for anyone in my life, I don't want to work. And he decides to reject all these people and become a farmer. Quickly changes his mind, decides he actually does want to become an influencer, wants to become a better person, wants to become kind of a positive energy influencer, encourage young people to go to school, to work hard, basically the opposite of what he'd become famous for, is ostracized by his fans because he's done a 180, and eventually finds himself scrubbed from the Chinese internet, basically. Like every WeChat channel he opens, every Douyin account that he opens, every Kuaishou account that he opens on these short video apps gets shut in a couple of weeks because he can never leave behind this image of himself as a thief and as someone who basically encourages people not to work, to withdraw from productive capitalist society. And I just found his story so interesting because it brings us into the enormously complicated and often quite dynamic world of the Chinese internet, despite everything we hear about internet censorship there. The bizarre world of influencers, which still is going on in China. And also this general idea of positive energy. You know, it's not just the absence of content, things that are taken down from the Chinese internet, but the state and state-affiliated actors actively also create stuff that they want people to see to promote narratives in times of great distress, emergency, or when they just want to highlight a certain angle to a story. And I thought that he encapsulated all those facets so well. Now, I think what you're getting at, Kerry, is that Zhou Liqi later tried to, or people at least representing him, then tried to sue me after the story came out because he said that it made him look bad. And so was I frustrated with him? No, I ultimately saw him as a victim of this whole system. And I think he was really, really lost in it. And he ultimately didn't, he tried to open a restaurant business of his own, which is how I met him in person. He ended up becoming the brand ambassador for, ironically, a brand of electric scooters. And I don't think that's doing very well. His restaurant, I learned last year, has closed down. I think it got hit by the post-COVID economy slump. So I see him as a victim in all of this, trying to kind of wade his way through all these really, really complicated politics and not having a North Star.
I mean, one of the sort of most interesting, but I suppose difficult to read accounts you give is of your visits to Xinjiang during a lot of the incarcerations, then afterwards. And you kind of had quite a lot of, inevitably quite a lot of harassment. When you did these stories, you'll be just interested to know what it was like to be there and how you kind of dealt with that clear kind of official harassment and kind of obviously the outside world paid a lot of attention to it, but the story that you tell is one really of families being split up. No one really knowing what the hell was going on. What did you sort of make of all of this as you were going through it? How did you process what you were seeing and what you were experiencing?
I went to Xinjiang many times, maybe, as a reporter, maybe 7 or 8 times, for usually a few weeks at a time when I was in China. I first went as a tourist, and it was just, I loved it. I never expected that China could include a place like Xinjiang. And it buttressed this idea that China, to me, had an incredible organic diversity that I thought was a huge asset. And it was about a year after I'd first gone as a tourist that I started hearing from friends that their friends were disappearing, they were going into detention. It wasn't quite called detention, it was called something, the Uyghurs had euphemisms for it. At that point, this was 2017, it was the early stages of the detention campaign as we know now, and many Uyghurs were being sent to kind of just makeshift facilities and former schools or offices. It was not the highly securitized so-called re-education camps that we saw later on in 2018-19 that China started building or expanding. So I just went. No one really knew about this stuff before, so I think what was a strength is I had no expectations. I think sometimes we scare ourselves when we know what we're going to confront, but I had just no expectations. And people are also really, really willing to talk about the detention still in Xinjiang at that time, in 2017, 2018, because they also had for most people at least, no frame of reference for this kind of detention campaign. It quickly got, by I think late 2018, 2019, really hard to do original reporting on the ground in Xinjiang because people would follow you, all the things that you usually hear about. And in Xinjiang, they started trialing out some of the now ubiquitous digital surveillance and monitoring systems that I don't understand fully how they work, but they work very, very well, to the point where I remember, I think I had gone on a trip to Sichuan province, really not a sensitive story, I thought, whatsoever, and I had booked the plane tickets as I was getting to the airport, and I caught a random taxi that took me out to this village, and the propaganda officials still managed to find me in remote Sichuan province within like 5 hours. So, just really, really advanced stuff, but they trialed this first out in Xinjiang. And so as I kept following the story, it became an on-the-ground reporting story to a very much diaspora-driven story where we would be talking to people in Central Asia and Europe and Turkey, and the information they were getting from family within China, but abroad. And then no information started to come out because those pathways started getting closed down more and more. And so then, as you know, it became a big data story. It became, can we hoover up as many procurement documents from local governments and analyze trends there and look at satellite imagery and look at leaked court documents and things like that. And some great reporting has been done by the BBC, by the FT on kind of just looking at data and trying to find trends there. Unfortunately, I think the story is not completely, but it's, the Uyghur issue has taken a back seat as Trump mania comes back, as I think Europe is dealing with things like the war in Ukraine, unrest in the Middle East, and part of that, I think, is both political interest, but also it's becoming really, really hard to break new stories and kind of move editorial ground on the issue of Xinjiang, because the government has made it so hard to cover it. And a lot of people have been released from these camps. They have been, I think in the government's eyes, adequately, quote, re-educated, and people who have been most recalcitrant have been sent to prisons and sentenced to long-term sentences there. My challenge in reporting about this over the last few years is, how do you humanize these stories? Because there are so many heartbreaking stories that would be valuable for readers or listeners or watchers to learn about. But how do you make these people real? And how do you make them feel like they could be someone that you might know, just speaking in a different language, maybe looking a little bit different in a country that you've never visited before? And that's why I ultimately decided to focus, if I had to have one chapter on Xinjiang in this book, why I decided to focus on this family. Because I think, to kind of encapsulate, the family that I decided to profile for this book is a Uyghur family that has Turkish nationality, and this is where they get lucky. And unfortunately, they're separated from their children in Xinjiang. The father is able to leave the country, but the mother has to stay, and the two young children who have Turkish passports are sent to a state boarding school for, I think it was almost a year. And when the father finally manages to reunite with these children through the help of Turkish diplomats in Beijing, he finds that they have basically completely forgotten how to speak Turkish and Uyghur because they've been forced to speak Mandarin. This was difficult for me to report because I'm a very proud Mandarin speaker. For me, recovering my identity, or learning more about my identity, has been investing time in learning Mandarin. But this was a language that I really didn't want to speak with this family. But anyways, long story short, this family is now reunited. They live in Istanbul. Since the book has come out, the father has actually died of other health issues. But I just felt that their saga threaded the needle so well and so tragically on so many of these questions of language politics, of identity, of national security policy in China, and the ongoing crisis in Xinjiang.
Just finally, before I sort of open it up, you have an interesting chapter on asylum seeker from Hong Kong who goes across to Taiwan, and then I think eventually America, if I remember. And you refer to a Chinese person in Taiwan who is seeking asylum there, I believe, and they just have a very, very tough time. It seems that people who don't fit in contemporary China don't have any easy places to go to. I mean, you mentioned Xinjiang and people going to Turkey, I guess, but you also mentioned the Hong Kong booksellers and, kind of, even though they had Canadian passports, I think a couple of them, they were still sort of embroiled. I mean, do you think for those who don't subscribe or don't find strategies to sort of subscribe to the mandated identity framework, I mean, you've got a chapter on Inner Mongolia, for instance, that's similar sort of issues to Xinjiang, but obviously more about language teaching and not maybe as harrowing, but still important. I mean, I guess the picture you kind of portray is quite a bleak one, because these people who don't fit in and do find exits don't really fit in where they go to too. They have a tough time.
That is why I wanted to, I think you're onto something. It's why I wanted to end the book on the diaspora, because I think that there is a lot of hope there and a lot of identity flexibility in people who are creating diaspora communities or diaspora networks for news coverage and books and translation and things like that in Mandarin and Cantonese outside of the PRC, outside of Taiwan. The stories that you're talking about are twofold. So there's one Chinese student who I profiled over several years who ends up trying to seek refuge in Taiwan, thinking that Taiwan is going to be this Chinese democracy that's going to welcome him with open arms, because he not only is Chinese like them, but he also shares their political values of liberalism and democracy. And it turns out that Taiwan is not a perfect society, and it's had a very, very difficult time both accepting and absorbing a lot of these refugees from Hong Kong, and has had a long, long history of basically rejecting political refugees from China for various security reasons, and also, straight out prejudice sometimes. And I wanted to use his story to talk about Taiwanese identity, which is incredibly complicated. I wrote most of this book while in Taiwan. And so that did end up shaping the latter half of the book. and understanding how both the evolution of the discussion of Chinese identity is both expanding and also narrowing in places like Taiwan, where there's incredibly robust intellectual debate about things like this. And the other narrative that you mentioned is this Hong Kong asylum seeker who decides that he's also going to escape by fishing boat to Taiwan, makes it, but for the same reasons, Taiwan does not want to keep them, and he eventually comes to the US. For the Chinese student, it became an issue of being too Chinese. He's seen as suspect, he's seen as a national security threat in Taiwan. And I think finally, last year, through marriage, he was able to get some kind of permanent identity in Taiwan, which would allow him to finally finish his university studies at the age of 28, I believe, and eventually get a job. And the Hong Kong asylum seeker is still doing very, very well in the Virginia area. But I think both of them just show that the debate about identity has real consequences. And there's no easy solution. I get asked a lot about this book, how can we support Chinese students who are studying abroad on American campuses who are afraid for their security and restraints to freedom of speech? And there is no easy solution. But part of the reason why I wanted to write this book is to make people realize, there's more than one type of Chinese person, that China is not a monolith. The wrong thing to do would be to simplify, I think as the American government is, to simplify all Chinese students as kind of the same and say we're going to apply the same level of scrutiny to everyone, no matter what they're interested in, what they're studying, who they are, where they come from. And to humanize people.
Well, one thing I think your book makes abundantly clear is you've got to be there. And I believe that there's less Western or European and North American representatives of media in China than there was like 100 years ago. It's incredibly, the FT and others do have people there, but most don't. I guess what I didn't, and presumably you, no one else foresaw, was our own governments would attack our media. And so I think the NPR still exists, or it's,
It very much exists, I hope,
right.
when I go back home
but is it,
tomorrow.
its funding is not, it's not kind of been impacted by the sort of swinging cuts to other, sort of public or federal funded entities?
Not yet. So there was an executive order, I think just this month, forbidding NPR and PBS, which is the publicly funded television network in the US, from accepting federal funding. That is pretty blatantly illegal, and I think a court will strike that down pretty soon. What's lost in this also is that NPR and PBS, sorry, I've done this spiel a lot, they don't get a lot of direct federal funding. PBS a little bit more than NPR, but I think about 1% of NPR's budget comes from the federal government. And that's because we're content providers. We make stories, we sell those programs, and we have a wide network of people, of member stations, of radio stations, and not just the US, but also Europe, Asia, Australia, kind of anywhere where people want to listen to English language programming, who buy our shows. And depending on those stations, oftentimes they're serving underserved communities, rural communities, all for free. They get varying degrees of federal funding. And what is concerning now is there might be a move soon to pull back about $500 million of funding for those stations. That will have to go through Congress. It's an open-ended question as to whether they'll agree to that, and if so, how much money they're going to pull back. This would impact television much more than radio. Television is just costlier to make. And on top of that, there's moves perhaps to investigate NPR, to investigate PBS in terms of regulation, hiring practices, broadcast licenses. So the attacks on the free press and public media in the US are multi-pronged. They're still open-ended and ongoing. But I have to say, when I was writing this book, I did not anticipate that maybe some of the themes and ideas and plot twists that the people I was profiling were facing might become scarily familiar for people in the US.
So your next book is about America. And thank you very much for coming. It's been really a great
Thank you for
pleasure.
hosting me, Kerry.
Thank you for coming.